Hey, welcome back. This week I've got Ryan Palmer on the podcast. He is the lead pastor at South Haven Baptist Church in Springfield, Missouri. We're going to talk through some issues connected to how pastors deal with stress, how pastors can process those things that they have to deal with that maybe it's not their strongest suit, but things that need to be done nonetheless. So it should be a valuable conversation. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week, we're blessed to have Pastor Ryan Palmer with us. He's the lead pastor at South Haven Baptist Church in Springfield, Missouri. Ryan, how are you doing today?
Doing tremendous. It's good to be with you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you here. You and I guess we've known each other for about 5 years.
It's been a while.
6 years.
It's been 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I know we were on a committee together working on some faith statement kinds of things at one point. I think that was the first time we really got the chance to meet and get to know one another.
Yeah, exactly. I've been off the board now, I think 3 years. So, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago that we did that work.
Yeah, man. Time flies. Well, with that being said, because we were just talking a second ago about how time flies in terms of your experience in ministry there at South Haven. So talk a little bit about yourself, your family, your history in ministry, things like that.
Sure. Well, I've been here at South Haven going on 15 years. It'll be 15 years this September, and my kids were first grade and preschool when I came here, and now my daughter is a junior there at SBU, and my son is a senior in high school. So the kids have gotten older. My wife Paula and I have not aged any. I think we look the same as when we came here, but and I had a unique experience in that the church that I now serve as lead pastor, I had served as a staff member back in the mid to late 90s.
Okay.
When I was a college student, I did an internship here under one of our previous pastors, and he liked me and hired me onto his team. So I spent about 3 years here back in the 90s, and then I left to go to seminary, pastored another church, and then 11 years after I left, they brought me back. So I've spent in total about 18 years here at this church, almost
All right.
my life, and so it's been a cool experience. I tell people I've been at the bottom of the totem pole, I'm at the top of the totem pole, and the view is exactly the same.
Yeah, how about that? All right, so some of that varied ministry experience that we were just talking about, you've had the chance to serve in a church while you were in seminary down at Southwestern. You also have had the chance to serve at South Haven. That varied experience ties well, maybe is a better way to say it, to the main question. What are the top 2 or 3 experiences that are the most challenging experiences that you've had or seen or experienced in ministry? And what are the top 2 or 3 suggestions you'd give for younger pastors to deal with those challenges if they're facing them themselves?
Yeah, in 23 years of being a lead pastor, and then I spent 4 years on staff at a couple of different churches. I've had a lot of different experiences, and I think the challenges really are contextual. The challenges I had in my first pastorate, where it was a small staff, and I know that many pastors, the churches they start off in, it's single staff. They are it, and so the challenges in those contexts versus in a church now where I have 8 of us on ministry staff, they're very different. I would say now maybe one of the greatest challenges in this context is that staffing issue. When you have that many people at the table, there are challenges just kind of keeping everyone focused on the same thing, keeping everyone on the same page. When you're in a smaller staff or a single staff, those challenges are different. But I think in my range of experiences, probably the number one challenge I think every pastor deals with to some extent is just stress, job-related stress.
Yeah.
I think, and that's not unique to pastoring. I think that's true in just about every field, but there are some unique challenges to it with pastoring. Part of it is, as pastors, as church leaders, we are expected to be somewhat of an expert on a lot of different things. We're expected to be great communicators and preachers and teachers. We're expected to be great business leaders and have some business savvy and sense as we manage an organization. We're expected to be visionaries and have great leadership skills. And that alone just can be overwhelming sometimes, especially the
Yeah.
younger you are when you're just starting out. Um, you know, now that I'm almost 50, I'll be 50 this year. Hopefully, I've honed some skills in some of those areas. But when I started out as a senior pastor at 27 years old, I knew a lot of theology coming straight out of seminary, but I didn't know much
Yeah.
about people and leading. And so there's just a lot of stress that goes with that. Managing the criticism that you naturally get when you make a decision. Somebody's not going to like anything that you do. Managing the family ministry balance.
Yeah.
I remember um, not not that long ago when my son's a senior in high school now, but when he was probably about kindergarten age, 6 years old. Um, One day, it was a Sunday afternoon. I just distinctly remember this. We were in the kitchen and I was getting ready to go back to church. And he said, "Oh, do you have a meeting?" And the
Oh,
word
wow.
meeting had become a dirty word
Dirty word. Yeah.
because meeting meant dad's not here playing with me. And so just managing all of that, there's some challenges that go along with
Yeah.
that. I think that's one of the big ones that every pastor deals with.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I had just had a conversation not that long ago. I think it actually might be the episode right preceding this one with Jim Mislowski
Yeah, yeah,
here in Missouri, who's the Developing Leaders Director. And this is part of what we talked about, this idea of there are all these expectations that pastors typically have. And part of what we got to, and honestly, I think it was part of what we talked about after we stopped the recording. And we're planning another episode later on where we're really going to get into it a lot more. But uh, just an understanding that not every pastor is gifted in every single one of those areas, right? The model that I've been thinking through lately for that is actually from a guy named Pat Lencioni. Are you familiar with his work?
yeah. I've heard of them. Yeah.
So in that Pat Lencioni model, the widget model, the working genius model, there I'll just list it out the 6 stages. It's wonder, invention, discernment, galvanizing, enablement, and tenacity.
Mm.
And it really has to do with just how stuff gets done, right? We think of wonder as that top level. This is coming up with creative new ideas. So this maybe ties to the idea of vision that you brought up. Invention is coming up with possible solutions to implement for that vision. Discernment, that next level, is evaluating some of those ideas to see which one you think might work, which one might not. Galvanizing is the ability to get people on board. And so in a church setting, getting volunteers on board, getting other staff members on board is vital in coming alongside and moving forward with the vision. Enablement has to do with really the willingness to jump in and volunteer, to just get in and to get things done. And then tenacity is seeing it across the finish line. Those people who just really take joy out of making sure the final touches at the end are as high quality as the first touches, not the person who gets toward the end and are like, I just want this done. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
So with that being said, here's some extras that go along with that, right? Every job is a 6-letter job. Everything that we need to do, it takes all of those categories. But we're typically really gifted. We have working geniuses that are 2 of those categories. We have working frustrations, so the bottom end, there are another 2 of those categories, and working, we'll say, competencies. And so you're good at those things, but they're not what jazz you up the most. They're not what you get the most excited about. And part of what Lencioni talks about, and I think it speaks to the nature of stress that you brought up, when you're stuck working in those ones that aren't your top tier favorite 2, and you're just stuck in those other ones all the time, that can facilitate, that can build some of that stress.
Oh, absolutely. And when you're starting out as a young pastor, you may not know what those strengths are, and
Yeah.
so you kind of learn that by trial and error. Um, for me, when I came here to this church, I had enough self awareness because of 8 years of pastoring experience at a previous church to know
Yeah.
preaching and teaching is my wheelhouse. That's where I find Wednesday night Bible study is my favorite thing I get to do. I get to
Nice.
teach for an hour and discuss with people. Administration sucks the life out of me.
Yeah.
I have often said I do administration because I have to, not because I want to. And of course, in a smaller staff church, I had to do a lot of administration. And so I
Yeah.
had to surround myself with people who were better at it than me, volunteers, finance committee people, deacons, things like that.
Yeah.
In a larger church setting here, I've been able to bring on a church administrator, which has been so freeing to me. My first couple of years, I didn't have that here. And
Yeah.
I found myself just sometimes drowning, trying to keep my head above water in the administrative roles. And now that I've been able to pass that off to someone else, it has freed me to really find more joy in the other areas. Again, there's always that trade-off. You move into a larger setting with more staff that can
Yeah.
share your weaknesses, and you staff toward your weaknesses, but then you have those staff dynamics now that you're having to manage. When you're just managing yourself as a single staff person, it's easy, but you have
Yep.
other stresses that pop up from time to time.
So let's assume that, somebody listening out there is a younger pastor. They're early and maybe a first pastor, and they're recognizing about themselves that administration is not their gift. They love preaching, they love teaching. Administration, like you described, sucks the life out of them. What do you suggest?
I think a couple of things. The younger you are, the more your church is probably going to be not so much aware of that, like they're seeing these glaring weaknesses, but the more willing the church is probably going to be to help you in those things.
Yeah.
When I was a 27-year-old kid right out of seminary, no one really expected me to know how to run a church. And typically in a smaller church, you're going to have some deacons, some lay leaders who are willing to help in some of those areas. So I would suggest to a young pastor, if you have that self-awareness to see where your weaknesses are, be open and transparent with some trusted leaders. I wouldn't share it in a sermon with the whole congregation, but if you've got some trusted leaders, maybe a deacon or two, a mentor in your church, I would encourage you just to reach out to them and say, hey, I am struggling with this. Maybe there is an opportunity to staff toward that. Maybe there's a retired business leader in your church that you can bring on part-time. That's how we started here at South Haven. Our administrator role, one of my deacons was a retired CFO of a local company. And I said, I could really use someone with your financial know-how to come in and help us with some things. And so we just brought him on part-time and have expanded that role some through the years.
Nice.
So I would just be open, be transparent with trusted people, and then release that to them. All the while knowing that there's still expectations. You still need to be in the know. We joke around here at South Haven that Ryan can't read a spreadsheet. I'm numerically dyslexic, but I have great people on my finance team that can help me navigate those things. But I still need to have my head in the game and know what's going on. So
I'm hearing a couple of things in there. One of them, I'm really thinking back to what we just talked about with what I just talked about with Jim on the last episode. And that's this sense of, somebody who's just getting into the pastorate feeling like the burden is to get better and better at doing more and more.
Yeah.
And part of what you're speaking to is also speaking against that idea. You need to be able to look at and mobilize the folks in your church who have those gifts in areas that you're not gifted or that are really draining for you.
Yeah.
But you do have to keep your finger on the pulse and
Sure.
know what's going on.
And I think, again, if we think about it just theologically and biblically, the Bible tells us that God gives gifts to the body.
Yeah.
And if we really believe that God has gifted and loves his church, then there are people in your church that have those gifts that you don't. And it's finding them, it's mobilizing them, it's encouraging them. Sometimes it may be, begging and pleading and arm twisting, but those gifts are there. And so finding those gifts and moving them into those areas of ministry.
It also occurs to me that I guess it's less a character trait. It's humility. It takes some humility.
Yeah, it does.
Which I'm hesitant to call a character trait because it's something we all have the capacity to grow.
Yeah.
Right. And so it takes some humility to say, I'm not the one for this. I'm not the best person for this particular role, whatever it might be. And I can yield this to someone else. And this is actually a good thing. This is a God ordained thing
Yeah.
to yield this to somebody else and mobilize others in the body.
It's very endearing to your people. I think in most
Oh,
situations,
yeah.
we all have heard those horror stories of those churches. Well, we hired you to do this, and they just kind of treat you horribly.
Yeah.
But I think for most of God's people, it is endearing to have a pastor who is humble. Humility will get you a lot of tenure in
Yeah.
ministry, and I think it does. You endear yourself to your people, and when you show them that you trust them, I think that it puts a lot of change in your pocket.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree with that for sure. So that's one, and it's really one aspect of stress that we've talked about. What else would you have to say regarding, things you found helpful in just dealing with stress?
Well, and I think part of it is every person is wired different. So we all
Right.
manage stress differently. I think for some people, if you have some outlet that works for you, some people have a hobby, some people have an outside interest beyond ministry, that our life is not at the church all the time.
Yeah.
To have those interests that you can dive into and invest in. Um, my marriage is one of my safe places. My wife and I just have a very healthy marriage, and so every pastor is different in how they bring their wife into their ministry, but I tell her everything. And so
Yeah.
she is a great sounding board to just listen and let me vent frustrations when I'm having those. She can see right through me before I vent. Often I'll come home and she'll say, "Was someone mean to you today?"
Yeah.
And I'll say, "I don't want to talk about it." Well, I know she knows. She just sees through that. So I think having
Yeah.
that healthy family life, having that healthy marriage life, having some other outlet for some of us, we go play golf. For some of us, we go to the
Yeah.
gym. But having some place, something where you can disengage for a while. I think beyond that, some things that have really worked for me. I have a group of pastors that I meet with once a month
Mm.
here in Springfield. Um, Being here 15 years, when I first came to town, all of the pastors in my pastor group, we were all under the age of 40. I was
Yeah.
35 years old when I came here. So I was in a group of pastors all under the age of 40. Now I'm in a group where I'm one of three who aren't yet retired. So I'm in there with some old guys, which I love because some of these guys have
Yeah.
been at it 40, 50 years, and they pour into me a lot. But that's a place where it's just safe. Sometimes we talk shop, just what's going on at church. Sometimes we just talk personal. What's going on with you? What are you struggling
Yeah.
with? What's going on in your family? And we just encourage each other, pray for each other, challenge each other. I think having those kinds of relationships, it's difficult. I think another challenge, but I'll put this under that label of stress. I think a big
Hmm.
challenge for a lot of pastors, especially if you're in a smaller church, single staff, is that feeling of isolation and loneliness.
Yeah.
And there is always this tedious balance of, I just said you need to be open and humble about your weaknesses, but there's a balance of how transparent you can be as the pastor with the people that you're pastoring.
Yeah.
That's just a delicate balance, and you kind of really have to evaluate that on the level of trust you have in those relationships. So having some relationships outside the church where you can
Yeah.
just be authentic, be real, and let some people into your world. That's been a great source of stress relief for me, and I'm building. Uh,
Yeah. That it occurs to me, those things that you mentioned in there, like none of those happen just by accident, right? I mean, like the person who goes to the gym's got to put some effort into that. The person who's got another hobby going to play some golf, they've got to put some effort into that. The person who's got a good marriage has put some effort into that, and so all of those, it takes some intention to be able to find those pathways. And marriage, in my opinion, if you're married, then that's the first one, right? That to really invest in. Uh, that they don't just happen by accident. They don't just
and,
happen on
and if
their
you
own.
don't put that investment into that marriage, it will become yet another source of your stress. It just
Oh
will.
yeah, yep, agreed. So stress is a big one, and we spent a good bit of time talking about that. What would be another challenge you've seen or experienced in ministry?
I think again it's contextual to where you are, but I
Hmm.
think in this current state, I think polarization has become a big
Oh,
challenge for a lot of pastors. And you
yeah.
can look at that from a number of levels. Of course, we always think of the political polarization, the cultural polarizations that are going on right now in our world. And then, of course, for us as Southern Baptists, there's always those denominational
Yeah.
polarizing issues that come up, and that can pull and tug at you, especially when that stuff starts to creep into the body of your church. You know, I try not to go back and talk about the COVID years because I think we are in a post-COVID world now. But
Yeah.
when we were going through the COVID situation in Springfield, our city shut down all businesses, and that included churches, for 12 weeks. And when we were finally given the light to reopen, we came up with all these different policies and procedures of how we
Yeah.
would socially distance and sanitize and all of that. Well, within my congregation, I had one man who has a number of health problems, and he just thought I wasn't taking this seriously and didn't care about him and that I was opening way too soon. On the other hand, I had an attorney in our town who was suing the city over the masking ordinance. So I had people on both sides of extreme poles, and I
Yeah.
get to pastor them both and love them.
Yeah.
And I think so when you put it into politics of Republican, Democrat, Trump, Biden, I have to pastor both of these people. When it comes to
Yeah.
cultural issues, where do we stand on these issues of sexuality and gender? And the Bible has great clarity on it, but people also have it real in their families
Yeah.
and in their
Yep.
friendships. So, how do you pastor and love these people who are just on these diverse edges? And when it comes to denominational, I think I've done a pretty good job of kind of keeping that at bay from within our church. I'll
Yeah.
talk about it with my pastor friends and all, but we don't really get into a lot of that stuff in house. But I think that polarization it can contribute back to the stress. But I think beyond that, it's really a pastoral issue of how do you love people who are very different.
Yeah.
And we look to the scriptures. You look at some of the disciples that Jesus brought on his team. He had a zealot on his team.
Hmm.
That's polarizing.
Yeah.
And Jesus is just, as in all things, Jesus is that perfect model of how to love and lead people that are coming from very different places.
Yeah. And that perfect model, who, by the way, prayed specifically for us to have
Yeah.
unity, right? I mean, when I'm thinking of the high priestly prayer in John, kind of 15 through 17, it's that same idea of unity is the target. And it's interesting to me. So polarization is something I've spoken about multiple times. I've actually preached on it here in chapel. This us versus them kind of mentality that we've shifted into, and it's morphed over the years to not just us versus them, not just I'm the only one who's right and you're the only one who's wrong, but in the church context, we've even taken it to I'm the only one who's right and you're maybe not even saved and probably a heretic based on what you're believing. And so it's what you're believing about Trump, Biden, Republican, Democrat, mask, don't mask, vaccines, not vaccine, all of that stuff that I think COVID really threw into high gear. But it hasn't gone away either.
And I think through that, we've gotten to the point, as you were just mentioning, where every issue becomes a polarizing issue. Things that should be rather innocuous just become extremely polarizing. To where people are fighting over their football and baseball teams. I mean, sometimes it's silly, sometimes it's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But I think that is a real pastoral challenge of how do we preach and teach biblical truth? How do we stand firm on the gospel and what it points us to? And at the same time, love people who may be in different places, try to help people who are in those different places love each other. I think that if you're worth your weight as a pastor, you can learn to love people who differ from you, but helping them to love each other, when they're in the same Sunday school class. And sometimes you have to be creative in those things, but I just think that that's becoming an increasing challenge for pastors and for churches of how do we navigate these issues that are ripping us apart as a culture, and
Yeah.
keep that from ripping us apart in the church? And one thing that I've done, this may not necessarily be the practical, this goes back to the theological. As I preach and as I teach, I try to constantly keep a kingdom focused. That hey,
Hmm.
folks, we are citizens of a different kingdom,
Yeah.
and our ultimate hope, it's good to be engaged in these issues. It's responsible to vote. It's good to have these values, and it's important. But my citizenship is in heaven, and my
Yeah.
hope is not who's on the top of the ticket with an elephant or a donkey. My hope is in a lamb, and
Yeah.
and you've got to be consistent in teaching that, to remind people we're part of a different kingdom, and let's not get caught up in the kingdoms of this world.
Yeah, I don't think I'm confusing multiple Bible studies from my past here, but I'm reminded of just some of what I learned going through experiencing God when I've gone through that in the past. Of course, Henry Blackaby just passed away the other day, and uh, I gained a ton out of that study. That was the first big significant discipleship I had in my life. I actually went through that study a couple times early in my walk with the Lord, and then I've taught it a couple times as well. But just the idea of that transition to a kind of a kingdom view
Yeah,
of how you view your world and where you're coming from is critical. And the only thing I think that it really allows us to rise above what culture is doing at this point, which is that kind of like what you were talking about, constantly at each other's throats. And
yeah, yeah. Well, right now I'm preaching through the book of Daniel on Sunday mornings, and there's
yeah,
just this constant reminder in that book: the kingdoms of this world won't last.
yep,
And that doesn't mean there aren't important issues that we're dealing with in this season, of such a time as this. But
yep,
these kingdoms won't last, and so I'm gonna put my energy and my emphasis in a kingdom that will.
yeah. Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, we're at a point. Uh, I think we're kind of closing in on that time, around that 30-minute mark. I'm wondering, are there any final, piece of advice, any final things you would say, any resources you would recommend, anything like that?
Not so much resource. I mean, there are countless books out there that are great on shepherding and pastoring. But if I were talking to 27-year-old Ryan,
Hmm.
coming right out of Southwestern Seminary, going into his first church, I think three things I would say to him that I learned over time, but wish I'd known then, is I wish I would have gone slow. I think
Mm.
that is a trap that we come out of seminary, we're excited, we've been given this position and some authority, and we want to just change the world for Jesus. And that's great. It's great to have that sense of ambition and all, but going slow will get you far. Take some time to build some relationships with your people. Um, Build relationships with trusted influencers in your church. At my first church, I was there 8 years, and I really became the pastor at year 5.
Yeah, wow.
Um, and some of the most effective things we did were in those last 3 years. And that's not exciting, but to go slow, I think is important.
Yeah,
I'd encourage young guys to stay a while. I don't know what the current trends are, but I think the old research was the average pastor stays about 2 to 3 years.
yeah.
Um,
3 was the old number I used to
yeah,
hear. Yeah,
stay a while, build some tenure. Tenure is your friend. Um, I've been
yeah,
here 15 years now, and I'm just able to do things that I could not do in year 1 and 2, just because I've built some relational clout, and I've built a
yeah,
lot of trust in people, and I've got a lot of trust that they have in me now. And so I would just say go slow and spend some time. For a young pastor, one of the best things that I ever did, you talk about a resource. It's not a book, it's not a discipleship material. I would find a mentor.
mm,
I That was invaluable to me, and I wish I had done it in year 1. I did that in year
yeah,
6 at my
mm,
first church. But there was a retired pastor that had been an effective leader in a strong church in our region, and he retired and moved to our church because his daughter was in our church.
Yeah, how
I
about
just went to him one day. I said, Pastor Ray, you've done this for 50 years. I've done this for 5 minutes. Could I just pick your brain some? And so every Thursday morning, I went over to his house and we went down to his basement, and he would have coffee. I'd have a Diet Dr. Pepper, and we would just talk shop. And he said to me, he said, you pick the topic. He said, I'm not going to teach you and train
Yeah.
you into seminary. He said, you bring the topic, you bring the issue you're facing, and we'll just talk through it. So sometimes I maybe had a staff issue and say, Pastor Ray, how did you deal with something like this? And
Yeah.
we just talk through it. And that was just so invaluable to me. And I'm now at that age where I'm getting to be that for some younger pastors.
Yeah. Which is, it's a cool thing to experience, to be able to do that kind of thing too. So
it is. And so those would be two things that I would really encourage for any young guys. Take it slow, build some relationships before you start trying to transform the world and transform your church.
Yeah.
And find a trusted mentor that you can just be really open and honest with, and that can help you to navigate these things and to keep you from getting into the weeds.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to say that there's something else hiding in there for any pastors who are listening to this that have been pastoring for a while. Be willing to be a mentor, right? I mean, that's one of the things that surprised me the most out of all the episodes I've done when I talked with John Marshall early on, and he talked about, young pastors that he meets with, and he asked them one day what they valued in it. And they basically came back and said, nobody else is doing this. So to be able to pour into the next generation of pastors is hugely important, and it's not done anywhere near enough. So if you're listening and that's something that you feel a calling toward, definitely be willing to move there.
There are plenty of young pastors out there that need it, and there's plenty of old pastors out there that could offer it.
Yeah. Ryan, thank you so much for being on the show today. Any final comments? Any last words?
No, I think this is great what you're doing. I think that this is a great encouragement to those of us in this world, and keep it up.
I'm glad to do it. And for all of you listening, thanks for being here and joining us today. And I'll have a new episode for you next week. God bless.